September 2025. The world watched as tension rippled through the global stage. The announcement from Washington hit like a thunderclap across continents. The United States suspends all immigration from Burkina Faso. No warning. No explanation. Within hours, airports filled with confusion. Students stranded. Families separated. Workers told to pack their things. 12,000 citizens suddenly caught between borders and bureaucracy. At JFK Airport, a Burkinab mother held her crying child as officers checked papers that no longer existed. At Dulles, students in university sweatshirts stared at their phones in disbelief. Visa revoked. The message was short, cold, final. In Houston, construction workers lined up outside job sites that were now closed to them. And in Washington, lawyers' phones buzzed non-stop with one question echoing through every call. What happens to us now? But thousands of miles away in Ouagadougou, the response came not from fear, but fire. President Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier-turned-statesman, stepped before the cameras. His eyes were steady, his voice unshaken. "This is not policy," he said. "This is punishment. It is tyranny disguised as law. And it is an insult to Africa." His words spread faster than the decree itself. Across Burkina Faso, radios crackled to life. In markets, drivers turned up their car speakers. In classrooms, teachers paused lessons so students could listen. From Niamey to Bamako, from Dakar to Nairobi, his words carried the weight of a continent long told to stay silent. Within hours, the streets filled. Flags waved. Drums thundered. Chants rose into the dry Sahel air. "Africa will not bow!" For the first time in years, the anger of a people did not scatter. It united. Western commentators called it another Trump shock, but African broadcasters called it something else entirely: the reawakening. Behind closed doors, diplomats whispered about something deeper. They spoke of memos, classified cables, suggesting the immigration freeze was not about migration at all. It was about leverage, about gold, about the continent's vast untapped reserves that had become the new currency of power. Within the African Union, voices that once spoke in whispers grew louder. "This is not just an attack on Burkina Faso," one delegate said. "It is an attack on every African nation that dares to stand independently." In Washington, the official line was simple: national security. But in reality, the message was unmistakable: defy us, and you will pay the price. In Ouagadougou, the government established a crisis task force overnight. Phone lines flooded with calls from parents asking if their children would be deported. University halls echoed with unease. But the tone of the leadership was clear. Our students are not criminals. Our workers are not pawns. We will not trade our dignity for visas. That line became a chant. That chant became a movement. In the days that followed, solidarity surged across Africa. Students marched in Mali. Workers rallied in Niger. Even in the streets of Paris and Washington, young activists, African and American alike, held signs reading, "Education is not a crime." On social media, a single phrase trended for days: "We're not collateral." But as protests grew louder, so did the stakes. The United States doubled down. Trump, standing before a crowd in Ohio, declared, "If they want access to our markets, they will respect our rules." His supporters cheered. But in Africa, that sound was heard differently. Not as strength, but as arrogance. For many, it was no longer about visas or students. It was about dignity, the right to be treated not as subjects, but as equals. In a televised address, Traoré spoke again. The speech would later be replayed across the continent, his words engraved into memory. "They thought they could break us by targeting our children. Instead, they have awakened a generation. Africa is not a land of servants. We are partners, or we are nothing." The crowd outside the palace erupted. Flags waved through the night. For once, the voices of the young, the poor, the forgotten were louder than the decree of the powerful. But behind the applause, the reality was grim. Flights were grounded. Bank accounts were frozen. Shipments delayed. Food prices began to rise. Diplomats whispered of new sanctions being quietly drafted. The weight of defiance was heavy. And yet, through it all, the people refused to bend. In Mali, student unions declared a week of solidarity classes. In Niger, farmers pooled grain for affected families. Across the continent, radio hosts repeated the same message. This fight is not Burkina Faso's alone. It belongs to Africa. As the crisis deepened, foreign powers watched closely. In Moscow, analysts spoke of opportunity. In Beijing, officials hinted at alternative partnerships. The world was shifting, and everyone knew it. But for Traoré, it was never about choosing sides between East or West. It was about proving that Africa could stand on its own. And so began a story that would test not just one man or one nation, but the very idea of African sovereignty itself. The next move, the world agreed, would define more than policy. It would define an era. The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty and resistance. Across American campuses, Burkinab students packed their dorm rooms in silence. Some had only one semester left. Others had just arrived. The confusion was suffocating. University administrators offered sympathy but no solutions. One student in Boston whispered into a phone, tears in his voice, "Mama, I did nothing wrong. Why are they sending me home?" In Houston, construction workers were told their permits would expire in weeks. Fathers who had built homes for others now faced the loss of their own livelihoods. One man described the moment a supervisor handed him the notice. It felt like a door slamming in my face, not just mine, but my country's. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, government offices overflowed. Parents stood in long lines at foreign affairs desks, clutching papers, hoping for answers. Ministers worked without sleep. Every report from Washington carried the same message: no exceptions, no extensions. Yet, even amid despair, something remarkable was happening. Ordinary citizens began organizing. Churches opened halls for public meetings. Teachers volunteered to tutor returning students. The youth called it the Dignity Network, and their slogan spread faster than any government decree. They can cancel visas, but not our future. Then came the leak. A European journalist released a classified memo from within the U.S. State Department. It read in stark, bureaucratic language, "Visa leverage provides bargaining power over extractive concessions. Priority, gold and oil." The meaning was unmistakable. This was never about migration. It was about control, about using policy to bend nations. The leak hit Africa like lightning. On radio talk shows, hosts asked, "Is our education now a weapon in their diplomacy?" In the streets, people shouted, "If our students are their leverage, then our unity is our defense." Even within the United Nations, African delegations began to demand answers. One ambassador stood and asked plainly, "When did education become a threat to global security?" No one replied. The silence in that hall said more than any statement could. And then came Traoré's second address. Broadcast on every channel, streamed across social platforms, his words pierced through the fear. They want to make our children collateral for their greed. They want to turn our brightest minds into bargaining chips. But Africa's youth are not tools. They are the torch that will light this continent's path. Crowds roared in response. It wasn't just patriotism, and it was personal. For every student stranded abroad, for every family waiting by the phone, that speech became a lifeline. Western media labeled him defiant. African media called him unbreakable. And in the hearts of millions, he became something else entirely, a symbol of resistance in a world still tilted toward the powerful. But symbols alone could not ease the crisis. Flights were canceled, visas revoked, permits frozen. The pressure mounted daily. Inside the presidential palace, advisors argued deep into the night. Some urged compromise, appeal to Washington, soften the rhetoric, buy time. But others insisted, if they bend now, the entire continent will bend tomorrow. Traoré listened in silence. Then he stood and spoke. "They have already isolated us. The question is not whether we stand alone. The question is whether we stand with dignity." His decision was made. Burkina Faso would not retreat. That same week, foreign delegations began to arrive, discreetly at first. Russian and Chinese envoys flew in under the radar, offering scholarships for displaced students and fuel shipments to offset blocked imports. Moscow offered partnership in mining technology. Beijing proposed new infrastructure deals. To many in Ouagadougou, it was the first time they saw the world's powers competing for Africa, not simply over it. Western analysts watched uneasily. A headline in Le Monde read, "The U.S. visa freeze is backfiring." A European diplomat admitted on live television, by trying to isolate Traoré, Washington may have elevated him. But inside the White House, the tone hardened. At a rally in Texas, Trump repeated the same refrain. "We will not be blackmailed by tiny nations. If they want to work with us, they must follow our terms." The phrase, "tiny nations," echoed across Africa like an insult carved in stone. Radio hosts replayed the clip on loop. One caller from Bamako asked, "Are we numbers in their speeches or nations with pride?" By the end of that week, tens of thousands filled Revolution Square in Ouagadougou. Students carried banners reading, "Our education is not a crime." Mothers held signs saying, "Our children are not bargaining chips." From rooftops and balconies, people waved the Burkinab flag as the crowd chanted, "Africa will not bow." The protests were massive but peaceful, an ocean of color and conviction. Even police officers stood quietly at the edges, hands lowered, as chants rolled like thunder through the capital. In Bamako, students burned paper contracts symbolizing foreign control. In Niamey, they painted walls with the phrase, "Cancel the blackmail." The movement was no longer confined to Burkina Faso. It had become continental. Meanwhile, in Washington, confusion reigned. Analysts had expected outrage, but not unity. They had expected protests, but not purpose. No one predicted that an immigration decree could ignite a Pan-African awakening. Inside the Pentagon, intelligence briefings began to warn of geopolitical realignment in the Sahel. The phrase was clinical, but its meaning was explosive. And in that growing tension, the world's gaze turned toward one man, the president, who refused to kneel. As the month drew to a close, one image defined the moment. A young student in Burkina Faso, holding her canceled American visa in one hand and a small national flag in the other. Her eyes fierce, unbroken. The caption beneath the photo went viral. "They closed the doors. We built our own." That image traveled farther than any policy paper. Because in that single frame was the truth that frightened empires, that power built on fear cannot silence pride built on purpose. And so, as the crisis deepened, the question shifted from "what will Traoré do?" to "what will Africa become?" The sun rose over Ouagadougou with the hum of anticipation. It had been 30 days since the immigration freeze, and the world was watching a nation stand alone. No one could have imagined that a single order signed in Washington would ignite a continental storm, one that was now reshaping alliances and rewriting the moral map of international politics. In those 30 days, Burkina Faso had changed. Students once dreaming of leaving now spoke proudly of staying. Entrepreneurs who used to wait for foreign aid began building networks of their own. From Dakar to Nairobi, the story of Traoré's defiance had become a rallying cry. The words "Africa First" echoed in speeches, classrooms, and marketplaces, not as isolation, but as self-respect. International media struggled to contain the narrative. Some called Traoré reckless. Others hailed him as the embodiment of post-colonial courage. But behind the headlines, the struggle was real. Sanctions began to tighten. American companies suspended trade deals. Aid programs were reviewed. Banking systems delayed transfers, blaming technical verifications. On the ground, that meant prices soared, fuel grew scarce, and families felt the squeeze. Yet in that hardship, something extraordinary unfolded: unity. Neighboring nations, once divided by politics and old rivalries, began sending quiet help. Ghana shipped fuel convoys overnight. Mali sent food trucks across the border. Senegal offered to take in stranded students. What began as a national crisis was evolving into a continental awakening. Traoré's government knew that every move was being watched. Foreign ambassadors recorded every statement, every meeting, every gesture. But the president remained composed, even in the face of growing pressure. In one closed-door cabinet meeting, an aide whispered that the American State Department had offered to reconsider the ban, but only if Traoré publicly adjusted his tone. He smiled, leaned back in his chair, and said quietly, "If a man must kneel for bread, then that bread was never his." That single sentence was leaked to the press, and within hours, it spread across Africa. Hashtags flooded social media, where stand like Traoré, no more kneeling, Africa rises. Everywhere, artists, students, and ordinary people began creating songs, murals, and videos celebrating the moment. It was no longer about Burkina Faso versus America. It was about pride versus pressure. The White House, meanwhile, was not amused. Officials described the African leader as a populist exploiting resentment. Television pundits framed him as a threat to diplomatic stability. And yet, despite every attempt to discredit him, his approval at home soared beyond 80%. Washington soon escalated. Sanctions expanded to include mineral exports. Western banks began freezing assets linked to Burkinab officials. Shipping companies were warned against docking in West African ports connected to the nation. The economic noose tightened, and the world braced for a collapse. But collapse never came. Instead, something unexpected happened. Russia announced a new financial corridor for African trade. China expanded its Belt and Road investment in the Sahel. Even small Asian nations, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, sent delegations to explore new partnerships. For the first time in decades, African nations began trading more with one another than with the West. At that moment, the balance of global influence began to tilt. Then came the invitation that changed everything, the United Nations General Assembly. When the African bloc requested an emergency session to discuss unilateral sanctions and migration discrimination, world leaders could not ignore it. Every seat in that hall filled. Cameras rolled. In that moment, the world expected a fiery confrontation, and it got one. As Traoré walked to the podium, the air was thick with tension. Delegates from Western nations leaned forward. Journalists whispered predictions. Some expected outrage, others expected apology. What they got was neither. He began slowly, his tone calm but piercing. We were told the immigration order was about national security. Yet no one explained how a student's dream could threaten a superpower. We were told it was about sovereignty. Yet, whose sovereignty allows another nation to decide who our children may become? The hall fell silent. Cameras zoomed in. He continued, each word deliberate. For too long, Africa has been seen as a guest at the global table. Today we declare, we are not guests. We are equals. We do not beg for inclusion. We claim participation. A murmur rippled across the chamber. Some applauded. Others frowned. But no one looked away. Our youth study abroad, not because we lack minds, but because we lack machines. They return not to beg, but to build. And when you shut the doors of your universities, you do not stop migration, you stop collaboration. He paused, letting the words settle. If our students cannot come to your classrooms, we will build our own. If our engineers cannot join your labs, we will create our own. If our talent cannot rise under your sky, we will light our own sun. At that moment, even those who disagreed with him could not deny the power in his voice. The applause began slowly, first from African delegations, then from parts of Asia, then from Latin America. Within seconds, it filled the hall like thunder. Traoré waited for silence and then finished quietly. You may call this defiance. We call it dignity. That speech became a turning point. The clip went viral across the world, translated into dozens of languages. In Africa, young people shared it under one phrase, a new dawn. In the West, analysts called it the speech that redrew the map. Even within the United States, public opinion began to shift. Students on American campuses held discussions questioning the fairness of the ban. Churches organized forums on global equality. Human rights groups issued statements demanding a review of discriminatory policies. For the first time, the issue was no longer about one man or one nation. It was about the moral compass of global power. As Traoré returned home, tens of thousands gathered at the airport. The streets were flooded with flags, music, and chants. Children climbed on rooftops waving banners that read, "Dignity has no visa." He stepped out of the plane, waved once, and smiled. The message was clear. No matter what followed, a new chapter had begun, not just for Burkina Faso, but for an entire continent ready to define its own destiny. The world was no longer silent. After Traoré's speech at the United Nations, the narrative that once painted Africa as a silent partner had shifted. Suddenly, nations that had never before aligned with African causes began to listen, not out of charity, but out of respect. For weeks, analysts on global networks dissected every sentence of his address. Was it a political gamble or a historical correction? Could one African leader truly change the tone of world diplomacy? And, most importantly, how would Washington respond? Behind closed doors, phone calls burned through the cables connecting Ouagadougou to world capitals. European diplomats urged calm, advising mutual understanding. The United States, however, remained firm. The immigration freeze would stand. No compromises, no exceptions. But even as the official stance hardened, cracks began to appear. Several American universities publicly questioned the ban, releasing open letters calling it a betrayal of academic values. African-American communities in cities like Chicago, Atlanta, and New York organized marches in solidarity with Traoré, carrying signs that read, "Justice has no borders." For the first time, the moral debate had entered the American heartland. Meanwhile, Traoré convened a summit unlike any other, a gathering of African, Asian, and Latin American leaders in Bamako. The agenda was clear: build a new cooperative platform, independent of the systems that had long dictated who could rise and who must remain silent. The world's media watched with curiosity, skepticism, and fear. For some, it was the dawn of a new order. For others, it was the start of a dangerous rebellion against the old one. Inside the summit hall, history was being written in quiet tones. Traoré addressed the leaders seated around a circular table. His words were measured, not loud, but they carried the weight of centuries. For decades, we have been told to wait for aid, wait for approval, wait for access. But our people cannot wait for dignity. We have been patient for generations, and patience has given us poverty. Now it is time for partnership, not permission. A murmur of agreement spread through the room. Delegates nodded. Some took notes. Others simply stared at him, sensing that this was more than a meeting. It was a movement. Then quietly, he proposed what no one expected: a coalition for equal exchange, a global bloc of developing nations dedicated to fair trade, shared technology, and collective bargaining on international platforms. It was ambitious, bold, and utterly unthinkable just months earlier. Outside, in the streets of Bamako, crowds gathered, not in protest, but in celebration. Flags from dozens of nations waved together. Young people chanted songs of unity, mixing languages but sharing one rhythm. It was no longer about one country defying another. It was about one voice inspiring millions. But as the movement grew, so did the resistance. The economic retaliation deepened. International banks increased restrictions. Trade insurance companies withdrew guarantees. Western corporations began quietly pulling out their investments from African projects. Within weeks, Burkina Faso faced shortages of medical supplies, spare parts, and even essential technologies. Factories slowed. Hospitals struggled. The opposition inside the country began to whisper. Was the price of pride too high? Foreign advisors warned Traoré that the nation's reserves could run dry within 3 months. He listened, nodded, and then said calmly, "We will survive without excess, but we will not survive without honor." Those words became a chant repeated in markets and schools. They painted it on walls, printed it on shirts, whispered it in prayer. The people were suffering, but they were not broken. Then a twist came, unexpected and global. Several Middle Eastern nations, themselves often caught between Western pressure and self-determination, announced humanitarian trade corridors for African nations affected by sanctions. Oil for food, medicine for minerals, technology for cooperation. Suddenly, the power map began to shift again. Washington watched in silence. For the first time, its economic tools were losing their absolute influence. What was meant to isolate one nation had instead united dozens. Inside the Pentagon and the State Department, emergency meetings were held. Advisors debated whether to double down or re-engage. Some argued that Traoré's defiance was symbolic, that time would wear him down. Others warned that if they didn't act fast, they could lose the moral high ground entirely. In the middle of this diplomatic chessboard, Traoré received a discreet message. A well-known global tech magnate, an American but sympathetic, requested a private meeting. The meeting took place in a neutral country. No cameras, no press, only the two men and a translator. The billionaire spoke first, his tone measured but curious. You've started something bigger than yourself. But the question is, can you sustain it? Traoré leaned forward and replied softly, I didn't start it. History did. I just refused to silence it. That line would later leak and spread online, igniting another wave of admiration across social platforms. By the time he returned home, something had changed. A convoy of youth volunteers greeted him at the airport. They were engineers, doctors, teachers, all trained abroad, all returned by choice. They had come home to rebuild, bringing their expertise back to the soil that had raised them. You inspired us, one young woman said, her voice trembling. You made us believe that we are enough. That night, as the city lights shimmered across Ouagadougou, Traoré stood on his balcony and watched. He could hear distant songs of unity, the hum of a people awake. But he also knew the hardest part was still ahead. The storm had not passed. The world was shifting, and with it came unseen dangers, covert campaigns, misinformation, cyber attacks. But Traoré understood something his predecessors had not. The new war was not fought with weapons or borders. It was fought with narratives, and for once Africa was telling its own. As dawn approached, he whispered to himself, They may have the networks, but we have the voices. The world was no longer watching if he would fall. It was watching how far he would rise. Excellent. Months passed, but the world did not forget. The story that had begun as a political standoff between two leaders had become something deeper, a test of dignity, resilience, and the global balance of respect. Across continents, people debated, argued, protested, and hoped. Traoré's name was now synonymous with courage, but also with controversy. To some, he was a visionary. To others, a disruptor who dared to defy the order that had long gone unquestioned. Inside his own nation, the atmosphere had changed. Gone were the days when people waited for outside approval. Farmers organized cooperatives to export goods through new trade channels. Universities began forming partnerships with non-traditional allies in Asia and Latin America. Even small rural towns held days of innovation, encouraging local youth to find solutions to local problems. The movement was no longer just political. It had become cultural, psychological, and generational. It was as if a continent, long silenced, had rediscovered its voice. But the price had been heavy. Sanctions had cut off vital imports. Several projects were halted. Inflation soared, and the government faced mounting pressure from both local and foreign critics. Even within his cabinet, some questioned the sustainability of his stance. They urged him to reconsider, to reach out, to compromise, to play the game. One late evening, as the rain fell over the presidential residence, Traoré sat alone by the window reviewing letters sent from citizens. One caught his eye. It was from a single mother in a small village whose son had been studying abroad before the immigration order had stranded him overseas. She wrote, I have not seen my boy in months, but I hear his voice in your speeches. I hear my son's hope in your courage. Even if I never see him again, I am proud that my country finally stands tall. He folded the letter gently, his eyes heavy but determined. He knew the fight was no longer about policy. It was about purpose. Weeks later, a global summit was announced, hosted not in New York, not in Paris, but in Accra. For the first time in decades, the world's cameras turned toward Africa not to cover crisis or conflict, but to witness diplomacy on its soil. Leaders from across the world arrived. The air was thick with uncertainty. Would Traoré soften his tone? Would he strike a deal? Or would this be the final act of defiance? When he took the stage, the room fell silent. He didn't begin with greetings or protocol. Instead, he looked directly into the cameras and began. There are moments in history when a nation must choose between comfort and conscience. Between surviving quietly and standing loudly, we have made our choice. Not against anyone, but for ourselves. He paused. The room stayed still. Some say we are isolated. I say we are independent. Some say we are reckless. I say we are awake. For too long, our people were told their destiny would be written elsewhere. In foreign boardrooms, in distant parliaments, in systems built without their names. But we have learned something powerful. Dignity does not come with permission. It comes with purpose. Applause rippled across the hall. Even diplomats who had come with skepticism began to nod. It wasn't the speech of a man seeking approval. It was the declaration of one who had already found peace in conviction. He continued, his tone measured but firm. We do not reject cooperation. We reject control. We welcome friendship, not dependency. The world changes not when one nation dominates, but when every nation is allowed to dream. The speech spread across the world within hours. Clips went viral on social media. Commentators who had dismissed him as naive began to acknowledge a shifting reality. Africa was no longer a backdrop to the world's story. It was now a voice shaping the script. Back home, people gathered in streets, schools, and town squares to listen to the replay. Elders wept openly. Youths danced, chanting his words in their languages. And in one small home, the mother who had written to him months earlier held her son's hand. He had finally returned after the restrictions were lifted. Across the ocean, Washington faced its own reckoning. Public opinion had turned. Humanitarian organizations, academics, and business leaders began questioning the effectiveness of isolationist policies. Behind the scenes, quiet diplomacy resumed. Not because of surrender, but because of understanding. Both nations realized that the world could not move forward divided by fear and pride. It wasn't a treaty nor a dramatic handshake. It was something more powerful, a mutual pause. A moment of recognition that change could not be imposed. It had to be chosen. As the months rolled on, the global order slowly adjusted. New trade agreements emerged. Student exchange programs reopened. African innovations began gaining international attention. And in every discussion, one phrase echoed, the Traoré doctrine, the belief that sovereignty, respect, and partnership must coexist. Years later, scholars would study that period as the spark that redefined international relations. But to the people who lived through it, it wasn't theory. It was survival. It was dignity. It was hope. In his final public address before stepping down years later, Traoré spoke once more to his nation and to the world that had once doubted him. I did not seek to change the world. I sought to remind it that we exist, that we matter. If our children grow up believing that their voice can stand equal to any other, then our work is done. He smiled faintly. Because freedom is not granted. It is remembered. And we will never forget. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause. Flags waved. Drums echoed. The sky seemed to shimmer with pride. And somewhere, far from the noise, a young student wrote in his notebook, "He taught us that silence is not peace. It is only the pause before a voice rises." The story of Traoré, fictional yet rooted in truth, became more than a political tale. It became a symbol of what happens when one leader refuses to bow, when one nation reclaims its narrative, and when the world is forced to listen. Because in the end, it wasn't about defying an order. It was about redefining respect. And as history would remember it, that changed everything.